presentation, and thanks for coming tonight. I'll jump straight in. I've been working on this for a while, but I've added in something to this paper that I haven't been very public about before. I'm going to speak first of all about the context in which the need for a critical theory of sex arises. Then I'm going to revisit something which will be familiar to probably a few of you, which is the sex-gender distinction. Then I'm going to look at an alleged critical theory of gender. And then I'm going to do that in order to show you why you can't have a critical theory of gender without a critical theory of sex. And then I will go back to the sex-gender distinction to say what a critical theory of sex will look like. But first of all, the context in which the need for a critical theory of sex arises. We know that we still need feminism because of the persistence of various inequalities and forms of oppression that relate specifically to girls and women. We know that these problems aren't invisible problems anymore. They're frequently addressed even in the mass media. And we also know that in order to address these problems and actually change things, we require political action and not just talk. But we still need to try to understand the basis of these inequalities and forms of oppression. We need to still try to understand why it happens and try to suggest different ways of understanding things that might allow us to imagine things being otherwise. When we identify certain kinds of contradictions, for example, the fact that people continue to believe in things that scientific research shows to be wrong, we have to try to understand how this can happen and what kind of ideological mechanisms are at work such that people continue to believe in things which can be shown to be wrong. And so we need to ground political feminist activity in this understanding. I think for a long time now you could say feminist theory takes as its task the specific job of understanding the basis of gender ideology and criticising it. But it also needs to work out why criticising it doesn't always work. And this is actually a more general problem we might pose in relation to various practices and disciplines. We might pose it in relation to artworks or art practices that claim to be critical or that want to be critical in some way or another. We might ask, what is a critical gesture that has no critical efficacy? Can it count as a critical gesture if it has no efficacy? What good is it to produce critical work that doesn't have any critical effect? Don't you need to understand something about the mechanisms of effect in order to produce really critical work? So, to understand my specific topic tonight, to understand why criticising gender ideology doesn't always work, we need to refocus, I think, on the category of sex. Let's quickly remind ourselves of the sex-gender distinction. Feminists have been using it since the 1960s. Classic version of it is in Anne Oakley's Sex, Gender and Society from 1972. You never think that you don't need to go back and read feminist texts from the 1970s. Generally people do. In that she says, sex is a biological category, it's a natural category. It refers to the functional distinction between the male and the female. That is, sex, strictly speaking, is or it ought to be just a category that refers to the distinction between the different roles that male and female play in reproduction. It's a zoological concept in that sense. Gender, on the other hand, is what we might call a social category. It refers to the different social expectations of boys and girls and men and women, and the different social demands made upon boys and girls and men and women. But it also refers, it's a complicated category, it also refers to aspects of the social forms and social relations which reinforce these expectations and demands. And these social forms and relations are in turn shored up by our conforming to expectations and demands. So you can see how the sex-gender distinction like that works. The fact that it is women who bear babies is something to do with sex. The fact that it's mainly women who look after babies is to do with gender. Feminists who thought the sex-gender distinction was useful often thought that biological conditions determine aspects of our existence in ways that we can't change, but the social conditions of human existence are open to change. And because the social conditions can be changed, because gender can be changed, even if sex can't, we should focus all our attention on gender. Of course, we know that sex can be changed, but the idea, as the sex-gender distinction was introduced into feminist theory, was that you should deal with the things that you can change most readily. So, for example, people thought that they could bring their children up in such a way that they could challenge gender ideology in bringing their children up. They weren't particularly concerned to change the sex of their children. And arguably, this idea that we can change gender, so that's what we should focus on, is still what contemporary feminism does. So, anti-page 3 campaigns, critiques of rape culture on campus, critiques of the objectification of women, the everyday sexism blog and so on, arguably are looking at gender ideology and trying to change aspects of gender ideology. Of course, once the sex-gender distinction had been made, things that had previously been ascribed to sex could now be ascribed to gender. For example, the fact that women tend to take primary care of children, not to do with sex, it's to do with gender. There could be things like that could be shown to be contingent and not necessary. And of course, these arrangements are going to be related to sex in some way, but feminists were able to argue that they weren't the causal result of sex. In fact, in the 1980s, let's say, the dominant view of the relation between sex and gender was that gender is the social meaning or cultural interpretation of sex. This means that social arrangements of gender are generally justified by those who stand to profit from their continuation by appealing to sex. That is, they're generally justified as being the natural form of social arrangements. So, for example, underperformance of girls in schools in the UK in the 1960s might have been, for some, evidence of the natural intellectual inferiority of young women in comparison with young males, young females in comparison with young males. But when the sex-gender distinction was introduced into education studies and then into educational policy, the underperformance of girls could be seen to be actually something that was socially conditioned. It's not to do with sex at all. The fact that girls now outperform boys at school and women outperform men at university is probably proof of this, unless young female humans got cleverer and young male humans got less clever in the last few decades. We can now see very clearly that underperformance of girls in schools in the 1960s was something to do with gender, not sex. But as I said, it was common in the past. We should discuss how prevalent this is today to justify these sorts of differences and to justify the different places that men and women tended to occupy in societies by appealing to sex. So they're generally justified as being natural differences or the natural form of social arrangements. And until recently, I think we could say that this was particularly true of macro social phenomena, such as the sexual division of labour itself, and indeed the structure of patriarchy itself. So that the hierarchical nature of the relation between men and women, or the tendency towards male dominance, was justified by saying, well, it's natural, it's to do with sex and it's natural. I think, interestingly, the tendency in this form of natural justification today, which comes primarily from evolutionary biology, scientific psychology and neuropsychology, is to explain not the macro phenomena, but the micro phenomena of gender differences, and to allow the justification of macro phenomena to somehow rest on the accumulation of lots and lots and lots of minute, tiny little differences. I'll give you an example of that later if you like. In a sense, both sex-gender feminists and the anti-feminists who opposed them shared the category of sex. But while anti-feminists are generally keen on the category of sex as an explanation for social existence, they're less likely to be happy with the category of gender. In fact, they're likely to deny the salience of the category of gender. Saw a recent example of this when the ex-Pope, now Pope Emeritus, took the opportunity of his Christmas greeting in 2012 to reject what he called gender theories and to argue instead for the naturalness of traditional family arrangements. So he argued in effect for the naturalness of the dominance of the male head of the household and the naturalness of heterosexuality, of course. Now, there could be no clearer proof, I think, of the critical potentiality of the concept of gender. If the Pope needed to criticise it in his Christmas speech, this really got something going for it, right? But what does it mean to say that it's a critical concept? Let's think about that. In 1986, the feminist historian Joan Scott wrote an article called Gender, a Useful Category of Historical Analysis. It was very influential. She distinguished between descriptive uses of the concept of gender and what she called analytical or analytic uses of the concept of gender. Descriptive uses of the concept of gender are those in which effectively gender is used as a synonym for women. Gender is associated with the study of things related to women, and there's still quite a lot of that about. According to Scott, the descriptive approach has no power to change existing disciplinary paradigms, but gender as an analytic category, on the other hand, was introduced into the discipline of history, she says, but you could make the same argument in relation to other disciplines, precisely with the intention of challenging and transforming disciplinary paradigms and dominant disciplinary concepts. The idea was to transform the nature of the discipline of history itself. Gender analysis in any discipline or practice, including art theory and fine art, doesn't just supplement the discipline, it actually criticizes the discipline. It aims to transform the discipline. Scott characterized gender, if you like, as a new category, or new from the late 1960s, a category that allowed us to question the assumptions of existing theoretical discourses and provide the basis for a more adequate understanding of social phenomena. It's also a new category that allows us to question the assumptions of everyday life. Now, the critical concept of gender is what we can call a transdisciplinary concept. So we can identify the origin of the concept of gender in its conceptual distinction from sex in certain psychoanalytical theory, but it wasn't introduced into that psychoanalytical theory as a specifically psychoanalytical term, not least because it was introduced to refer to socio-cultural norms. And it might be the case that there are specific disciplinary uses of the term gender, but the critical purchase of the concept of gender in feminist theory is down to the fact that it is transdisciplinary. It has a transdisciplinary function. It doesn't belong to any one discipline. Now, this may seem like a change of topic, but I can assure you it's not. The traditions of German critical theory and the philosophical discourses of French theory, which are now so influential in the social sciences and arts and humanities, are transdisciplinary too. Because we are accustomed to assign works to disciplines, we tend to think of the major works of thinkers like Adorno and Horkheimer, Foucault, Deleuze, and Guattari and so on, as belonging to continental philosophy. But actually, German critical theory and these theoretical discourses from France were constitutively critical of the dominant disciplinary forms of philosophy, to the extent that they identified that the dominant disciplinary forms of philosophy were, or at least they conceived themselves to be, what Marx called self-sufficient. That is, these dominant disciplinary forms imagined themselves to be independent of and uninfluenced by any empirical content, which meant for critical theory that they were idealist and ideological. Critical theory is precisely critical of philosophy understood in a certain way. That's why often they didn't call themselves philosophers. Now, there are, of course, traditions of Marxist feminist theory that share their intellectual roots with critical theory. Although in standard histories of feminism, you don't ever see a critical theory variant of feminism identified, socialist, liberal, radical, etc., but never a critical theory feminism. But as Kate Soper pointed out in 1989, there's a sense in which feminist critique is critical theory in the broad sense. All feminist criticism is critical theory in the broad sense. And to a great extent, if feminist theory feminist theory as critical theory relies on the critical potential of the category of gender. But we can't therefore just say we don't need to investigate gender anymore. We need to make sure that we've got the right concept of gender, or we need to make sure that we know what we're talking about when we talk about gender. Now, so far, I've talked about the sex-gender distinction, and I've left it intact, as it were, which I'm not going to do for very long. But before I come back to that, I'm going to look at a recent contribution to what the author explicitly calls a critical social theory. That is, I want to speak briefly about Sally Haslanger's philosophical account of gender. Now, this has attracted very much interest and exerted an enormous amount of influence in analytical philosophy, though it's not very well known outside of that context. We might ask ourselves why. I think you'll see why. And I'm going to look at Sally Haslanger both because it's very influential in philosophy and because I think I want to be able to show what's wrong with it in order to say what else we need. So Haslanger distinguishes between different ways of asking the question, what is gender? So just as I'm suggesting, she knows we can't take the category of gender, for example. We've got to ask, what is gender? And says, there are different ways that we can discuss it. First, we could imagine that when we ask the question, we're embarking on some sort of conceptual inquiry, which might be asking, what is the concept of gender that we use? Looking at ordinary language use and saying, what is gender? What does ordinary language use tell us gender is? But she doesn't want to do that. She says, secondly, there could be a kind of descriptive project which might ask, what natural or social kinds, if any, our gender vocabulary is tracking, with a view to developing potentially more accurate concepts through careful consideration of the phenomena. So it's like saying, in effect, you could ask the question, what is gender, by saying, what is the thing that word gender refers to, and making sure that the word and the thing it refers to are accurate. But that's not what she's doing either. What she says she's doing is an analytical approach in which we ask, what is gender, in order to consider the pragmatics of our talk employing the term. That is, we ask, when we ask what is gender, we're saying, what is the point of having these concepts? What cognitive or practical tasks do they or should they enable us to accomplish? Are they effective tools to accomplish our legitimate purposes? And if they're not, what concepts would serve these purposes better? So the thing I want to highlight is, for her, it's not about ordinary language use. That's not her concern. It's about constructing a definition of gender. So here's a little taste of analytical philosophy. This is her, I'm going to just speak briefly about her definitions of what a man is and what a woman is. Bearing in mind that these are proposed explicitly as a contribution to a critical social theory. Haslanger assumes the sex-gender distinction and is not at all concerned with sex. So her work is really about gender. This part of her work is really about gender, not sex. She defines gender, interestingly, as a social class. And given that this means that the relation between the class of men and the class of women is, by definition for Haslanger, one of domination and subordination, she aligns herself, although somewhat hesitantly, with the tradition of materialist feminism. And by materialist feminism, she means, or we can say we mean broadly, the related positions developed and defended notably by Christine Delphi and Monique Wittig. And Haslanger mentions these thinkers in a footnote, but doesn't go into any detail about what they thought. But actually, Delphi and Wittig didn't talk about gender, or at least primarily, Delphi and Wittig talked about sex. They argued that sexes, not genders, are social classes. And I'm going to return to that point. But nevertheless, Haslanger takes three guiding principles from what she calls the materialist strategy. First of all, gender categories are defined in terms of how one is socially positioned. Fair enough. They're not defined in terms of physical or psychological features. Secondly, gender categories are defined hierarchically. That's also fair enough. And thirdly, sexual difference is the physical marker that distinguishes between the social groups and is used in the justification of the perpetuation of the relations between the groups and the oppressive forms that those relations take. Now, to cut to the chase, having responded to various possible problems or objections to each step in her analysis, she ends up with the following definitions. A definition of a woman. We'll just take the definition of a woman, and I'll translate it out of its symbolic presentation into actual words. A person is a woman if, and only if, she is regularly, and for the most part, observed or imagined to have certain bodily features presumed to be evidence of a female's biological role in reproduction. I'll repeat that. A person is a woman if regularly, and for the most part, they are observed or imagined to have certain bodily features presumed to be evidence of a female's biological role in reproduction. And secondly, that a person has these features marks that person within the dominant ideology of their society as someone who ought to occupy certain kinds of social position that are in fact subordinate. And if a person fulfills these two conditions, they're regularly and for the most part observed, blah blah blah, and they therefore thought that they should occupy certain positions in society, then we can see that that plays a role in their systematic subordination. And if in these definitions you substitute male for female and privileged for subordinate, you have a definition of man. These definitions of gender as a social class and the definitions of man and woman that follow from it operate purely synchronically, absolutely ahistorically. There's no historical element in those definitions at all. She offers these definitions as the first necessary step in developing an account of gender to serve as an effective tool in the fight against injustice. That is in a critical social theory. And in doing so, she's partly doing what a lot of feminists in philosophy, both continental philosophy and analytical philosophy, have been doing for some years now, which is, rather than taking the category of woman for granted, asking, well, what is a woman? What is it to be a woman? What defines a woman? So not treating woman as a natural category, but saying that's something that's a social category that we need to understand. She says if we could develop a critical social theory, it would need to be able to identify and explain persistent inequalities between females and males, or being sensitive to their differences. It must be able to track the implication of gender in a broad range of social phenomena and take seriously the agency of women in being able to develop a resistance to gender. But can her definitions of what it is to be a man or a woman do this? I mean, can abstract definitions of gender do this? I don't think that they can. And to explain why, I need to revisit the sex-gender distinction. Now, it wasn't that long after the sex-gender distinction had become current in feminist theory that people began criticising it. And the critique of the sex-gender distinction takes different forms, but a common element in the different forms is the critique of the tendency of the sex-gender distinction to project sex, and more generally the body, as outside of the realm of social existence. So if you shift the focus of analysis wholly onto gender, it leaves the allegedly empirical, biological, natural category of sex unthought. Nobody's doing any critical work on that. Its presumption is that sex is unproblematic, that there just is sex and that's that. Feminists like Michelle Barrett, for example, said that were quite happy to say that sex was the basis upon which human social relations must necessarily be built. They're quite happy to affirm sex in the quite traditional sense. But shift of focus wholly onto gender protects sex from any critical philosophical scrutiny by virtue of its naive everydayness, or it forecloses the possibility of an investigation into that everydayness itself. For some critics of the sex-gender distinction, this meant that the sex-gender distinction led to the overvaluation of consciousness in relation to the lived body, and then you had feminist theorists revaluing, as it were, the lived body. Some sought to replace the sex-gender distinction with other categories, notably the category of sexual difference that they found in the psychoanalytic and more philosophical French, so-called French feminism of the 1970s, in which there was no linguistic equivalent of the sex-gender distinction. And I think that in theoretical discourses generally, it's this category of sexual difference that tends to be employed. But I'm not sure that most people who employ it have a good grasp of what they actually mean by sexual difference. In my view, aspects of psychoanalytical theory are absolutely indispensable for the feminist project of thinking sex and gender, but those aspects do not include the psychoanalytical conception of sexual difference, or sexuation as Lacan latterly had it. I think that reconstructive and possibly even utopian projects like those of Moira Gatens, Lucy Irigaray, Elizabeth Gross, to name just a few, are very important, and it seems to me that while they're very important, it seems to me that their primarily philosophical approaches are inadequate from the standpoint of the need for a critical social theory of sexed existence. So one can develop philosophies of sexual difference, but the relation of those philosophies of sexual difference to feminist politics is not always clear. And you know, some of them might very well agree, because their critical social theory is not their business. Sometimes philosophy is their business. But when it comes to a critical social theory of sexed existence, it's not a matter of preferring a sophisticated psychoanalytical conception of sexual difference over a crude sex-gender distinction. It's a matter of looking at the living ideology of sex. So the sex-gender distinction relegated sex to a biological given of no theoretical concern, but actually I suggest that sex is a complicated social phenomenon, and part of its complexity is precisely that it presents itself as simple and straightforward. It apparently refers to a value-neutral, merely biological natural division in kind, but it always, in fact, means more than this. The presumption that biological sex determines what it is to be a woman or a man is fully part of the meaning of what we can call the popular natural biological category of sex, by which I mean not a category that actually belongs to or originates in the field of biology, but one which we think belongs to the field of biology, or which signifies as biological with all that that entails. Now, you'll probably be familiar with Judith Butler's work around the time of Gender Trouble. That was first published in 1990. That work is in great part a response to the problem that the sex-gender distinction left the category of sex unthought. But unlike some others, Butler thought this problem didn't require that the category of gender be replaced with a philosophical category of sexual difference. She thought that, as is well known, she incorporated a critique of the category of sex into gender theory by arguing that what she called the metaphysical category of sex is an effect of a discursive effect of gender. She argued that the relation between sex and gender had been walking on its head, if you like, and Gender Trouble turned it the right way up. So sex is actually the metaphysical efflorescence of the material practices of gender, but it has paraded itself as their substantial basis. Butler argues in Gender Trouble that sex postulates or postures as a foundation, but its very being is illusory. She was concerned to show how the concept of sex is constructed, to show that as an effect of gender, sex is not, she says. It has no being. And she was concerned to show how, given that sex is not, the reiterative performance of gender both reproduces and subverts the fiction of sex and the compulsory and naturalised heterosexuality which goes along with it. Gender Trouble is fundamentally a book about gender identity, about the categories that sustain the fiction of substantial and stable identities and the everyday practices that subvert them. And although the motivating political problem was the way that the imposition of sex, gender, heterosexuality produces what Butler would later call unlivable lives, Gender Trouble itself errs on the side of subversion, which is perfectly appropriate to the extent that it is really a kind of a manifesto. So it celebrates the subversive aspects of drag and so on, which I'm not criticising it for. It's perfectly appropriate. But in Gender Trouble, sex is kind of deflated in the sense that you can deflate a balloon. It's shown not to be, right? That is a strong ontological claim that she makes. It is not. And that ontological claim can't in fact be sustained. To make that claim, Butler has to conduct the analysis entirely at the level of discourse and discursive effects. That, of course, is the classic criticism of Butler. And I don't want to align myself with critics like Martha Nussbaum, who were ungenerous in their criticisms of Butler and would dismiss Gender Trouble because of it. But the criticism does have some substance. And what I want to suggest is that sex is not as easily dethroned in practice as it is in theory. I mean, in a sense, what I want to say is, I believe that Judith Butler is right. Nevertheless, sex still continues to have its effect, and that's what we need to understand. No doubt gender is, as Joan Scott wrote, a useful category of analysis, but if feminist theory wants to understand how it is, in fact, that little girls and little boys are socialised in gendered ways, if it wants to understand how in fact the everyday gendered lives of men and women are ideologically underpinned and justified, then feminist theory needs to acknowledge the social reality of the idea of sex. So sex does have some reality, contra Butler, it has some social reality. And I argue this because I believe it to be a depressing fact that outside of feminist theory, or outside of the relatively small circle of influence of feminist theory, the sex-gender distinction has extremely rarely ever been made. So ask your parents if they know about the sex-gender distinction. If they happened to read feminist theory at university, they might, but most people have no idea that such a distinction can be made. In English, the tendency of the popular cultural use of the word gender gives a false impression, as if everyone's a gender theorist now. This is false because on the whole, when people speak of gender, what they mean is sex, and not the sex of feminist theory's sex-gender distinction, which is a sex that could be considered to be, in important contexts, irrelevant, but what Torrell Moy calls sex as pervasive, sex in the sense in which it was employed before the sex-gender distinction, where sex is thought as relevant in all contexts. This is what I mean by the dominant popular natural biological concept of sex. It's constituted with two presumptions. First of all, that there simply is sex duality. That is, there simply is an exclusive division between male and female. And secondly, that that duality is naturally determined, and more importantly, that that duality is naturally determining. This concept of sex, in fact, has no purely descriptive function in relation to human beings, because the constitutive and exclusive duality of its terms is empirically inadequate. That is, it just is not the case that human beings divide into two like that. It is empirically false to claim that they do, despite what we were probably all taught at school. It's empirically false that every human being is either possessed of an XX or XY chromosome configuration. There are plenty of other variants, including XX men and XY women. Just Google it and you'll find the literature on it. Plenty of babies are born with ambiguous genitals. There are plenty of babies born about whom we just can't easily say it's a girl or it's a boy, although these children will be made to conform with surgery and chemicals to the expectation of sex duality. according to the popular natural biological concept of sex. So you can see sex duality doesn't describe what nature gives us. It is what we impose on what nature gives us. And we impose it in particular brutal forms on intersex children, infants. So the concept of sex isn't descriptive, it's normative and prescriptive. It allegedly describes a natural foundation for human existence, but actually it stipulates a duality which is taken to be more or less determining for psychosocial existence and behaviour. Now that, of course, is the concept of sex that Butler subjects to criticism. But the criticism of the concept cannot be the end of the story, because as an effective idea, frequently wheeled out in the explanation of almost all aspects of human existence, it still plays a major social and political role. The presumption of this concept of sex, which is familiar from the everyday discourse of many parents of young children, can be demonstrated to be wrong, but the effects of its presumption have material consequences, and it's the persistence of the presumption and the social reality of its effects that still need to be understood. This is what a critical theory of sex would have to take as the object of analysis and critique. So sex in this sense, the sex that I'm saying needs to be criticised, is not simply the untouched sex of the original sex-gender distinction, but neither is it the sex that's wholly subsumed under gender in Butler's Gender Trouble. Sex, we need to acknowledge the persistence of the sex-gender distinction, not as a natural material given, but as a socially effective presumption. At the same time, it is something like the gender of Gender Trouble, to the extent that it acknowledges that this effective presumption is, at least in some sense, can be understood as part of gender. A critical theory of sex would thus deny the sex of the sex-gender distinction the luxury of being outside of critique, but it would also deny the perhaps unwitting implication of Gender Trouble that sex is over and that it doesn't exist. Actually, that's not an unwitting presumption. That's the argument of Gender Trouble, that sex does not exist. But sex does exist. It just doesn't exist in the way that people think it does. Butler is right. Sex doesn't exist in a substantial or essential form, but it does exist as the actualized presumption of sex in gender practice and ideology. I still think you cannot make any sense of gender practice and ideology without that concept of sex. Butler's position has trouble explaining why. The ideological or metaphysical status of sex having been revealed, we continue to believe in it. A critical theory of sex would instead have to include a consideration of all of the factors, including the reiterative performance of gender, that make that metaphysical illusion into a social reality. These factors include the relation between the sex-based explanations of gender and the perpetuation of those gender differences by those explanations. So currently, for example, here's an example of a sex-based explanation. People say that little girls have an innate desire to wear pink clothes. Lots of people think that. So we could perhaps say there's a gender phenomenon, and it's frequently said to be caused by sex, as it were. There's something innate in female infant human beings that makes them want to wear pink. That innate thing somehow leaves us when we become adult women. But what we would need to look at would also include the more general social and cultural conditions and the form of society within which gender differences appear. A critical theory of sex would have to take into account the relation between, for example, and this is probably one of the most important things, the presumption of sex and the production of commodities, the creation of gendered markets in relation both to adults, but also, and perhaps more importantly, in relation to children. Because what gendered markets produce the gendered markets for children produce is not just gendered products. Those markets actually produce gendered children. Any critical theory of sex thus has to deal with the complex ensemble of gender identity, capitalist forms of production, scientism and its popular consumption, and various modes of communication, which we can see reflected and perhaps justified or perpetuated in public policy. I say scientism and its popular consumption because because if anyone publishes a piece of research that claims to have found innate differences between men and women, it will be reported everywhere. It will be reported in the mass media. It will be in the Daily Mail, the Daily Telegraph, everywhere. So scientific explanations of gender differences, we can't get enough of them for some reason. In 2011, you may remember that there was a government-sponsored report called the Bailey Report, which is full title is An Independent Review of the Commercialization and Sexualization of Childhood. So a report that was addressing the concerns of the early sexualization of children, or concerns of gender stereotyping in children's clothing and toys. And in responding explicitly to the fact that some parents had expressed concern over gender stereotyping in children's clothing and toys, the report states, gender preferences are biologically driven and part of a normal, healthy development of gender identity. Can't back that up, of course. It just states, as if everybody knows, gender preferences for toys and clothes are biologically driven and part of a normal, healthy development of gender identity. It accepts that the reinforcement of gender stereotyping by the commercial world will continue so long as there is a consumer demand. That is, it makes no recommendations in that area, seeing nothing wrong with it. Here, the complicity between policy, commodities, and sex is particularly clear. It also shows that popular morality concerning the normal, healthy development of gender identity and its modes of enforcement are part of the complex social reality of sex. Let me just end by returning to Haslanger's account of gender, because I hope that what I've said has made it obvious what the problems with her analysis are. It's based on a sex-gender distinction. It leaves sex totally untheorized to perform its ideological work untouched. It invokes sex, or the presumption of sex, as the mark of gender, defining women as that subject for the most part observed or imagined to have certain bodily features presumed to be evidence of a female's biological role in reproduction. But rather than seeing that suggests the inextricable relation of sex and gender in any account of either one or the other, she puts it to one side simply to concentrate on gender. It suggests to me that it's precisely the popular identification of sex with gender that is the problem that needs to be analysed. And stipulative definitions of gender can't touch that problem. They can't do anything to deal with that problem. Haslanger isn't interested in any discussion of the ordinary use of the notion of gender, because she thinks, as a philosopher, the ordinary use is confused and inconsistently applied. But is it not precisely the ordinary, ideologically obfuscated use of gender to mean sex, along with its social consequences, which must be the object of any critical social theory? Haslanger's account says that these bodily features mark a subject within the dominant ideology of their society. But isn't it precisely this dominant ideology that needs to be criticised? And isn't this dominant ideology precisely the ideology of sex? So it's a circular argument. It doesn't deal with the thing that needs to be dealt with. Detached from the ordinary ideological function of the notion of sex-gender, Haslanger's account is so abstract that we might better see it as the stipulative definition of the members of an imagined set, or as a formal device for sorting persons into two groups called men and women. It's like the sorting hat in Harry Potter. Put it on your head and it will churn out whether you're a man or whether you're a woman according to the definition. A formal device for sorting persons into two groups called men and women. But isn't that the role of the ideology of sex, to sort us into two? Why do we want to produce theories that do that when the ideology of sex does that for us? So where does this leave us? What I've said about the necessity for a critical theory of sex is based on a critique of aspects of the sex-gender distinction. But it still is the case that feminists were really onto something with the sex-gender distinction. And it still is the case that the sex-gender distinction is inevitably useful in some contexts. If we want to maintain that the sex-gender distinction has got to be useful in some contexts, and it's got to be useful to the extent that the world hasn't even noticed it yet, and that it would be good to be able to distinguish between what's natural and what's social, how do we go about separating out what belongs to sex from what belongs to gender? And there are contexts in which we do want to do that, because, for example, we still need to think about biological reproduction. And we want to be able to separate off a purely biological meaning for the idea of sex, because we do know that the relation between spermatozoon and ovum in biological reproduction is fundamental, albeit we know that there are widespread parthenogenetic reproduction occurs even in large species. It's not so rare, parthenogenesis. Komodo dragons can do it, for example, and they're very large. So what do? Can we keep this abstract, purely biological conception of sex isolated from all the social determinants of gender? The trouble is, I don't think that practically we can. I don't think that in any actual human life there is any possible isolation of sex in this way. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stella. As ever, as with the talk that I circulated, I think you're immensely clarifying about not only the kind of history of these concepts, but the way in which the concepts that we think of as being philosophical are in tension with or inflected by everyday kind of commonsensical usage. I mean, I have lots of questions, but I want to open it out. But I do want to ask one question, which is that if the dualism of the everyday conception of sex is so pervasive, I'm just curious in terms of, because obviously this is a project we're developing, this critical theory of sex. Is the answer that, as it were, to be more scientific than scientists, and as you were pointing out, to kind of develop the spectrum of the sexes more historical, and to point to societies where that didn't attain, or is it that there was actually a kind of there's some deeper sort of transcendental illusion? There's a kind of there's a dualistic element to human thinking, which the kind that Hegel would have criticised. Is there a kind of a fundamentally dualistic nature to rationality, which is going to keep replicating these things? And to go back to what you said at the beginning, in that sense, critique can't touch. Is this a bigger problem than the way we think about sex? Is this some more fundamental problem of conceptuality?
Yeah. Well, to speak about science first of all, because there's a great book by Anne Fausto Sterling called Sex in the Body, I think. Now, she's a biologist, and she famously wrote an article called, I think it's called How Many Sexes Are There? And from the point of view of a biologist, she argued that there were at least 5. And in the book, I think it's called Sex in the Body. It's a really, really wonderful book. She shows, for example, how medics determine in ambiguous cases whether the infant in front of them is going to be male or female, and how there's an actual way of measuring the phallus, which is the general name for the penis and the vagina, and how arbitrary it is that some of those infants become males through surgery and chemicals, and how some become females. So there's very important work by biologists like Anne Fausto Sterling that show us that we live with a fantasy of biology. We live with this fantasy of the biological concept of sex that isn't true. But I think that when if feminists think that the way forward is to use this science, they actually have to become scientists. Because anybody who wants to talk about science will easily be confounded by someone who actually knows about science. Now, I don't know about science, right? I'm not a biologist, so I don't think that I could possibly do that. And I think it's a mistake, because there has been not a tendency, I wouldn't call it that, but there is some work in feminist theory based on Anne Sterling's work, which argues primarily that the main reason to be suspicious about sex is this, what can be discovered by science. But I think you need to be a scientist to do that. And I've seen the way in which scientists can easily dazzle people who want to speak about science. So beware.
But where does that leave the transdisciplinarity? That idea of a critical theory that has to be critical of disciplines as such. We have to reinstate the idea of needing to be a scientist to.
Well, you just need to have a certain amount of knowledge in a certain area. But it's not that there are some quite interesting work as well by a French theorist called Elsa Dorling, who looks at the work that people have done interviewing medical practitioners who are responsible for gender assignment of intersex babies, and shows how of all the people in the world, the ones who know best about this are the scientists, and yet they're the ones who continue to assign gender as if it were dual. And their argument, and in fact it was for a long time the argument of various intersex lobby groups, is you do have to assign gender, because it is actually almost impossible to grow up without an assigned gender. Whether you have to perform surgery on bodies and give infants drugs is another matter. If it's life-saving, of course you have to do it, but mostly it's not life-saving. You do have to assign gender, but not because society demands that we are gendered. You couldn't bring a child up in this society without them being assigned to one gender or another. What schools do all the time is if they want to separate the class into two, they separate them into girls and boys. It's the first thing they'll do. But you mentioned, I don't think that there's a dualism inherent in human thought. I don't think that's the case. So Simone de Beauvoir said something like that in the introduction to The Second Sex. Later on, she saw that was merely idealistic, presumption. But you also mentioned transcendental illusion. It could say that sex does function like a transcendental illusion, where a transcendental illusion is a term taken from Kant's philosophy to mean something of which we can have no experience, and something which we can demonstrate to be false, but in which we nevertheless are compelled to believe. Now, for Kant, transcendental illusions were historical and necessary. So, for example, there was no way of demonstrating the existence of the immortal soul, but he thought we were compelled to believe that we were endowed with an immortal soul. And being compelled to believe it didn't matter, so long as we didn't then try to prove that its parts were simple and blah, blah, blah. It could be that it's a historically contingent fact that we're somehow compelled to believe in sex. And maybe it wouldn't matter if we were compelled to believe in sex, if nothing followed from it, but so much follows from it. So in a society in which we're compelled to believe in sex, if you're a young woman who by the age of 30 hasn't had a child, people are going to start telling you off, and they're going to start talking about your biological clock. You are going to feel under pressure to do what you are naturally supposed to do. So it could be that it's in fact I have argued elsewhere that it functions a bit like a historical transcendental illusion. Kant didn't think they were historical, but perhaps it's something that at the moment we simply cannot get rid of. That argument, actually, interestingly, was made on the basis of work by Robert Bernasconi, who showed that for Kant, race was a transcendental illusion in that sense. There are no such things as races, but for the purposes of understanding the differences between human beings, we needed the concept of race. I think we can imagine a future in which we can do without the concept of race. I think probably we can imagine that. I think that future is a long way off yet, because we need race to understand racism. But can we imagine a future without this concept of sex? one reason we can't is because we keep thinking, well, what about biological reproduction, you know, but so what about biological reproduction, you know? Why does everything have to come down to biological reproduction? This is the argument you find in Student with Firestone, by the way. Go and read that one. Dialectic of Sex, 1970.
Questions? Yes.
Hey, is this on? Oh, it is. You just ended actually what I was wanting to talk about or ask you about, and you're talking about how can we live without a concept of gender? And I was wondering, like, because I do know people, or I know kind of people, I suppose, more so, not so much close anymore, who like are having children and who have like, you know, who are trying to do the thing where they don't have their child, where they try not to like gender their child, which is like socially sort of impossible, because if, like, even if they're the close circle of, I guess, like affiliates do not want to like impose, let's say, like directly gender pronouns on their child, basically every close family member, close working member wants to kind of gender their child for them, and how exhausting that can be. I was wondering how much the importance of biological reproduction does show up in your research, and especially as, you know, a sort of like very heteroproductive method of reproduction, how that ties directly to the sort of reproduction of capital bodies that you're talking about.
Well, it's a very big question. I can't
Yeah.
answer that. I can't answer that yet. But the relation between biological reproduction and social reproduction has never really been adequately thought. Although there have been attempts by Marxist feminists, notably, to try to think that, it never really has been. It really have ever got to the bottom of that. What you say makes me want to respond. That it indicates to me that actually children it's children that we need to focus on in a way, because there's a sense in which by the time we're adults, it's too late for us. We're gendered, and you know it's a bit too late for us. What we really need to focus our attention on is what we're doing to children, whether or not you have children, because that's it's not about our own children, but focusing on what we are doing to children. What kind of world would we have to produce such that we didn't have to gender children? What kind of world are we living in such that we gender them even more than we did in the 1970s, actually? There's more gendered. I think the lives of little girls and little boys are in some ways much more gendered now than they were decades ago. It's this, you know, some people want to reproduce biologically. Most people will spend most of their lives being unable to do that. Most women will spend most of their lives being unable to do that, either because they're too old or they're too young. Why is it that thing that some of us might want to do at a certain point in their life is allowed to have such a dominating presence in everything that we think about men and women? It's true that if you want to reproduce sexually and you are female, all things considered, it's best to find a male to do it with. But this is a very small part of our existence.
Surely not. It's the entire continuance of the species.
But we can adopt children. We can have children in lots of different ways.
Them first.
Yeah, but then why should the fact of having had them, or why should that fact dominate the way that we think about what we should do? Why should
we
there?
wouldn't be here without them.
Well, look, I have reproduced myself. I'm a fan of biological reproduction, but the fact that we do it doesn't really, you know, why should that mean that the way that we think about all other aspects of our life should be determined by our role in reproduction? Given that a great many of us will not reproduce, given that a great many of us cannot reproduce at any time in our life, why should young women, start to feel from a certain age that they are expected to reproduce? Why should they be expected to reproduce? none of these questions can be answered unless we get drilled down to the ideology of sex, which says it is natural to reproduce. It's not only natural that you can do it, but it's natural to want to do it, and unnatural not to want to do it. So it's true. I mean, we will die out, but as what's her name? Valerie Solanas said, if the Society for Cutting Up Men killed all men, then the human race would come to an end. She said, well, so what? So good about the human race. The planet will probably kill us anyway soon because we're destroying it.
There's a reason you're the last lecturer. Other questions?
I was wondering your take on trans politics and the kind of role, I mean, I'm sure you get this question a lot, but what it would mean, especially, and I don't think you meant this necessarily this directly, but when you were saying that it didn't matter if you were an adult or that it was too late, when I think it still very much does for a lot of people, and like, what would it mean in relation to both of these categories when someone is transitioning from male to female, or, you know, maybe not identifying as either, and how that plays into both of these kind of categorizations. Sure.
And then the identification of gender with images. So I'm thinking of things like the theory of the young girl. So if you anything to say to that.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think I don't want to. I'm not going to speak on behalf of trans people. From the one point of view, you can say there's no one is more oppressed by the ideology of sex than a trans person. On the other hand, trans narratives often are themselves completely complicit with the ideology of sex. Very often trans people do not want to be spokespersons for the abolition of sex, quite the contrary.
Well, they're made to operate that way, though, I think.
Yes, but they're made by gender theorists into you know, beacons of radicality when they don't always want to be. They just want to live their life as a man or as a woman. But society is very unwilling to let them do that. I mean, we're perhaps more relaxed about it now, but I was thinking the other day, you know, in my university, there are only male and female toilets. And I thought about what it would be like to propose to the university to have a trans toilet, and thought how unlikely it would be that they would agree to that, actually. So it's a difficult question. I don't want to speak for trans people. I didn't really quite understand the question about images.
Yeah, so I was thinking of ideas around self-representation and how that might mediate ideas around gender and sex, and if that's part of your thinking in any way.
Well, only to the extent that I think that there are no self-representations outside of dominant ideologies, in the sense that you simply can't step outside of it. You can't take a position outside of it, because your identity is conferred on you, almost, you know, probably more than your identity comes from inside you. Your identity is conferred on you from the outside, so you have no say in that. There's a sense in which you have no say in that. And so, as we're talking about children, if people attempt not to gender children, or if somebody is gender ambiguous, everyone will be forever trying to categorize them, to find out, you know, what they are. And there was one recently, a case that was reported of a couple in Sweden, of course, who would not gender the child, and the only people who knew what the child's genitals looked like were the parents and the carer of the child. And whenever I looked at websites where it was discussed, the level of hatred addressed to these parents was extraordinary. I mean, really extraordinary. there's a kind of presumption that when you do that, it's you are imposing some kind of ideology on the child, as if, you know, femininity and masculinity aren't ideologies that we impose on all children. But it comes from the outside, it's imposed on you from the outside.
I've got a question. I'm over here wandering around. I might sit down. I guess I just wanted to. So I'm interested in this whole kind of like gender normative colour thing. You know, the blue for a boy and the pink for a girl. And I remember reading somewhere that originally in the Victorian times, you know, all children would be dressed in white, and it was something to do with eye colour. So if the child had brown eyes, then they'd get blue, and blue eyes they'd get pink. So it's like not to do with gender. It was that original assignment of those colours, which has now gone completely insane. And I read an article recently that said, I can't remember exactly what it was, but it was some kind of like protest in the separation of boys' toys and girls' toys. So boys, the word boys, and then all blue, and then the word girls and all pink. And as far as that kind of attempt to break down the distinction went, was that the text went. So the text boys went, but everything remained sections of cars and blue stuff and princesses. And I mean, what hope is there, do you think, for some kind of like reappropriation or like getting rid of that prescribed gender within toys and colours? I mean, like, is there any hope for that? Is there just too much money to be made from that? And
Well, that's why you can't. The question is indissociable from the question of the reproduction of capital, and the reproduction of capitalist societies. It's Hamleys you're talking about, isn't it? Hamleys toy store, who got rid of the thing saying girls and saying boys. But then if you go to those floors, one will still be full of packaging of trucks and blue packaging of trucks, and boys doing active things, and the other one will still be full of dress-up clothes and makeup and sequins and things. It's an interesting phenomenon that from the point of view of a feminist like me, things have got worse in that respect over the past couple of decades. And even it's in education as well, I think, because in the heyday of multiculturalism and anti-gender stereotyping in London in particular, which is what I remember, teachers would have been taught, a kind of gender theory. You know, that when you were training to be a teacher, you would have been taught a kind of gender theory which tried to explain to you the social factors that influenced how well girls and boys did at school. Now you're more likely to be given, now you're more likely to have it explained to you why it is that boys are incapable of concentrating on two things at once. Why it is that boys are incapable of sitting still. It's actually very insulting to little boys, most of the stuff that comes out now. So it's an interesting phenomenon that there's been a regression in some respects. And the question is that regression something like the regression you saw in the 1950s and the post-war period? A regression that is in fact an acknowledgement of a kind of advance in another way. That is, women are less constrained in many ways than they used to be. And is this regression a response to that? What's the relationship between them? There was recently an article which did a study of colour preference among young men and young women, and it showed them different colours, and it asked them which ones they liked best, and it found that the women tended to prefer the redder, pinker colours, and the men tended to prefer the blue colours, whereas all previous studies had tended to show a universal liking for blue. And it found the only distortion in the data was from Chinese people, who tended to prefer red whether they were male or female, because red is a lucky colour in China. But the authors of the study, which was very small, went on to then claim they had discovered biological sex differences in colour discrimination. That is not preference, but the ability to discriminate colours. And they've speculated that this was because in the hunter-gatherer period, women needed to be able to spot red berries. And it's a silly piece of research that doesn't withstand any scientific scrutiny whatsoever. But what's interesting about it is not the research itself, but the fact that it was reported globally. You can find it in the New York Times. You can probably find it almost everywhere. What's interesting about it is not what it said. What's interesting about it is our willingness to consume this idea. Why is it that we are so desperate to consume this idea that there are these innate gender differences? If you read a really very, very good book by Cordelia Fine called, is it called Myths of Gender? Well, that's another book by Fausto Sterling. Cordelia Fine's recent book, it may be called Myths of Gender. She goes through all the scientific stuff that claims to show sex differences, and shows that overwhelmingly what that research shows is that there's almost no difference whatsoever. And when there is, it's not statistically significant. But if you produce a paper saying, I have proved that there is no significant difference between men and women's colour preference, no one's going to report it, no one's going to print it. So what's interesting is the consumption of this ideology, and consumption in the more literal sense as well, where everything must be produced in its pink and blue version for girls and boys, which actually causes you to buy more. Yeah, because if you buy one of those pink bikes with the streamy, remind of the pony bikes, you can't pass it on to a boy, can you? Unless he's a very radical and interesting boy.
Yeah, but before the colors were reverted,
Yes.
before the boys were wearing red or pink and the girls were wearing blue.
Yeah.
So it's funny that men are now little boys are feminized basically with the blue.
Yeah.
So but people forget about that.
Yeah.
Or maybe we need to find the third categories in the toy shop, like ungenderized.
Yeah.
But I know somebody who has a toy shop in somewhere, and they say parents come in and they want to find toys for boys and toys for girls. And even if she tries to diffuse that, it's impossible.
Yeah. So why is that? Why do we have this need to gender our children so in such an extreme fashion? Because it is very extreme, the gendering of children.
Sometimes you don't choose. I mean, I have a daughter, and I've never colored her with pink or whatever. For her third birthday, pink. She had fairy books, fairy tale books. She was a fairy, etc. I was that. I've never. It was really far from me,
Yeah.
And recently, sorry, just the last one, but there's been this thing going on Facebook with the Lego, the
Lego, yeah.
In the 70s, there was this little girl with the dongari and building, I don't know, something. Now you can't find that anymore. And people had this weird nostalgia for this kind of agenda.
Yeah.
But I also was thinking that it's also can be like that children are scared to be bullied.
Yeah.
If you don't like what other people like, then in schools it's very...
Yeah, absolutely. That's the force of it. I mean, like lots of parents, I suspect, I dressed my boys in pink until the point when they started feeling embarrassed about that. You can't continue to do something that embarrasses your child. You can't make them be a gender warrior for you. But it's
very pushed in his direction. We can't get out of it.
Yeah.
Still not.
Yeah. Yeah. So the strength of the ideology is extraordinary. It's very, very difficult to resist. And you see how public figures who in some sense resist because they refuse to conform in a certain way are pilloried for it. like Mary Beard, for example, who dares to be a person who is primarily an intellectual, not primarily a pretty person. She's subject to vile abuse because of that.
But isn't it the more reason to continue with resisting? Because it's how other ideologies are imposed on us, sort of cultural, it's identity is constructed in the same way as sex is constructed, and many other aspects of identity is constructed in the same way that you described, and it shifts to economies determining it as well as sort of for reproduction. And then, I don't know, I mean, I encourage my daughters who still wants to become a pilot and one who wants to be a mathematician. So I think there is still this personal choice to an extent which we can still sort of make, no?
Yeah, yeah. To an extent we can, to an extent we can do something about it. At a certain point, children's peer groups become much more important to them than their parents, and mostly children will then conform to their peer group. But studies of feminist parenting show that you have to wait for the rewards until the children are adults, because there is a point to it, but you might not see that during certain periods when the peer group has become more important than the parental influence, or that there might actually be an outward conformity that doesn't destroy an inward, non-conforming human being. And because if you look around, I don't see the audience divided into women wearing pink and men wearing blue, but that's, it's so stark with the gendering of children. Why is that?
Sure, but also, again, it's parents who conform into it.
Yeah, yeah. There's a series of photographic works by a Korean artist whose name I can't recall. I don't know if you've ever seen them. It's called Pink and Blue, and they're photographs of little boys and little girls in their rooms with everything pink and blue they have around them, and they're quite shocking in a way because of the extraordinary number of pink and blue things, and how they have everything pink and blue. So their comb, their toothbrush, everything is pink and blue. Some of the children in those photographs are actually babies, right? So they certainly didn't choose it. They had that chosen for them. The little girls had it chosen for them. Within a couple of years, the parents will be saying they innately somehow chose it themselves. But you can see, babies do not choose. They are, they are socialized into it.
I might just ask one more thing. Isn't it to do with science, us being able to know the sex of the baby, and then that working in that you then go out and buy specifically blue or specifically pink, so it comes to that knowledge of the sex in preparation, in buying, making a nursery, so it comes from I don't know.
Well, it probably does intensify the gendering of commodities for children. The fact that you can know before birth, so you don't. I think there was a time in the UK, for example, where it was traditional to knit yellow things for babies because you didn't know if it was going to be a boy or a girl. But there's none of that now. You can know.
I just wondered, you keep saying why the pink and the blue. I just think, might not nostalgia be a really strong factor in that? When you say the 70s, I remember, how my parents dressed before I was born, how they dressed me early 80s, like a boy. I looked like a boy until I was 11. But now everything has changed, and now everything is stressful and unstable, and everybody feels this. And, maybe this is really simplistic, but a need to go back to some stable order. And blue and pink is very clear, and this nostalgia sort of happens in steps of 20 years, 30 years, the 70s coming back in the 90s, the 80s coming back in the 2000s, and so on.
Yeah. Well, as I said earlier, that I think we need to think about the relationship between the what are, to me it seems undeniable, what are certain advances in equality, let's say, that if you compare the situation now to the 1970s, it really is, it is altogether better to be, it's better. You don't have to leave your job when you get married. You don't have to get your husband to sign your mortgage application. Nobody thinks it's weird if you want to do certain jobs. To the extent that we make these changes, is there a kind of regressive gender ideology reacting against it? Which suggests, if it were the case, it would suggest that it's not, traditional. The traditional way of viewing it as, for example, the retrenchment of gender ideology in the 1950s and the post-war period, when women had for the first time been working, or they'd been doing jobs that they weren't doing before. People understand the retrenchment of a very traditional femininity in the 1950s as an attempt to leave the job market open for the men again, to actually get the women out of the job market. So it was done for the benefit of men. But if your point is right, it's equally women who are uncomfortable, isn't it? It's equally women who find their freedoms uncomfortable or distressing.
Yeah, or maybe it's not. I mean, maybe it's just the stress that is translated into this gender binary, when it's not about that. Everything, of course, it's just about the market. It's about making more money. And so nostalgia is capitalized on, or people feeling unsafe in their identity, which is definitely not to do with being able, to have jobs that we weren't allowed to have before, but it's got to do with, a hyperfluid capitalism, I guess. Well, no, I guess, obviously. No, because, I can hold a microphone in a lecture, which is amazing. Obviously, my grandmother would not have been able to say a word without...
But maybe then it seems that you might be suggesting as well that as other identities become less available, so for example, as it becomes less clear how you identify as a British person, the gender identity is always available for you. It becomes less clear how you identify as an English person, or dominant ways of identifying as English are unacceptable to many people. But gender identity is always available. It's always something that you can fall back on.
Yeah, that's problematic though.
Can I ask, do you think also it has to do with the inaptness of language, because we don't have the words to describe sexual difference in a way that is more comprehended, or all those words, they have so much weight to them, it's impossible to sort of think beyond the rendition we know, or we've known for centuries. So do you think it's a task of linguistics and so philosophy in terms of like pushing the language so that it's more legible?
Well, on the one hand, I think you can't do what Sally Hasnanger does, which is redefine what a woman is in such a way that it bears no relation to the everyday use of the word, because that will just never catch on. On the other hand, people have introduced non-gendered pronouns, haven't they? People do attempt to use non-gendered pronouns. You can do it in a small way. If you try to use non-gendered pronouns in a world which doesn't know those non-gendered pronouns yet, nobody's going to understand what you're talking about. But for example, you can say their instead of his or her, and some pedants will pick you up and say that's not proper English, but language changes, and that's one way of changing it. So language use is very important, isn't it? But we can't I don't think that we can stipulate new definitions and expect the old ones not to carry on working. They will always carry on working. And that's the basic argument about sex. It's carried on having the meaning for us that it had before, even though we know all about the sex-gender distinction and so on.
Sure, but I suppose I was thinking also because in other languages, in some Eastern languages, say Georgian, which I speak, it's not gendered, and it's more apparent in English and other Western languages. So limitations of language.
Because we can't gender.
Because we can.
Right. Well, but it's not. I mean, it's even more apparent in gendered languages, isn't it?
Yes,
English is
exactly.
unusual in Europe, Southern Europe, in not being gendered anymore. Apparently, it once was. There would have to be a different conversation entirely if you were talking about working in a language where every noun was gendered, where you had to have gendered articles and so on. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, or other ones like that actually gender even more. German genders even more because of the transformations in the articles.
I'm just aware of time. I'm really loath to cut it short because it's such a discussion. I think we've got time maybe for one or two more questions. There's one here, and then there's one more over there.
I was reading, I think that there was a study that came out either last year or 2013, and I don't quite remember the details, but it was discussing that the real life implications of the gender differentiations between children's toys wasn't as significant as basically these marketing strategies were hoping it would be. I think a good example is, I have a friend who, her family is very patriarchally structured. It's very much based in sort of a cisgender heteronormative approach. And her son got angry with me for making, a female Lego knight because it didn't look like what was on the box. And while he was busy rebuilding that, the daughter who had the female specific Lego set was rebuilding the entire thing to build a castle. So she was utilizing these tools that were created for her to play with like a shopping mall and recreating it to be what she wanted it to be. So I was wondering if you could speak to that and also to the idea that we've been discussing a lot these things having to do with children and children's toys, but they're also very present in adults. There was the whole thing last year with Bic creating a women's pen that was completely pointless but cost much more. And the same thing with men's and women's razors and all these gendered products for adults where there's a price differential, and other than that, it's completely arbitrary.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it would be interesting to know how many people bought Bic for women, wouldn't it? Because it immediately was just absolutely ridiculed. So you can attempt that with adult markets, but I suppose there's a lot of kind of lifestyle marketing. So I don't, how many scented candles a woman needs, I just don't know, but the market for them is endless. So no, you're absolutely right. The adult markets are gendered as well, but they have to be. There's a sense in which sometimes they have to be a little bit more subtly gendered to work, because as with the Bic for Women example, it is so ridiculous. And I concentrate on children because, I'm thinking about Wilhelm Reich and how he thought we're talking about big changes that need to be made. We're talking about having to create societies such that we don't need to do this anymore, and we need to focus on the younger generations, who are the ones who, after all, are going to create those societies. We need need to focus on the possibilities for the future, and it's perhaps better to focus on the young. But then that also explains, in a sense, why the ideological focus is on the children. Why, it's as if gender ideology understands that the most important thing is to get the children early, even when they're babies.
Hello. Just a quick question. Thinking about a documentary I saw a little while ago with these monkeys. They had these monkey cubs, male and female ones, and they put out dollies and they put out some trucks with wheels on. And they noted that all the male monkeys would come and play with the trucks, and the female monkeys would go and play with the dollies. But they also talked about sort of like with this, there must be certain sort of physical and cognitive differences, really.
Well, actually, the research shows that there are no significant cognitive differences between men and women. Overwhelmingly, the research shows that. Really, overwhelmingly, it shows that. And it shows, there's a lot of very interesting research now on what's called implicit bias. You can read about it in Cordelia Fine's book. So, if you get a group of men and women, and you say, we're going to ask you to do a test, and that test is a test of mathematics, they'll perform more or less equally. If you say to them, we're going to do a test to see whether men are better at maths than women are, the women will perform worse than the men. So it's really astonishing. And it's very relevant in university contexts. It's really relevant in university contexts. So if you make something salient beforehand, then it actually affects how people perform. The same is true, of course, of race. By making race salient, you actually produce the differences that you claim to discover. It's a very interesting case, the idea that monkeys or chimps or whatever can choose trucks over dolls. Isn't it? Because monkeys don't drive vehicles. and they use tools in the same way. Right? So it's really fascinating how that piece of research...
Yeah, the projection.
Sorry?
I saw the documentary.
You see that as well?
Yeah,
I saw it too.
And how us humans who are projecting on monkeys or baboon or whatever it is. Yes, they can drive.
Yeah. The fact that but also what it's unclear what it teaches. Lions, for example, will once they've mated with a female, will eat her other children. But we don't believe that tells us anything very interesting about the behaviour of the human male. But when we find something that we think we can just pass over onto the to say something about human beings, then we pick up on it. We see how we are very much like monkeys. So monkeys cling on, to their monkey babies cling on to the adults, by actually holding on to their fur and their skin. We don't have fur or skin. We have skin. Right, so our babies can't cling on to us. And anyway, our babies are too weak to cling on. They just drop off if they try to do that. They just couldn't possibly hold themselves on. So we can see, when it comes to basic survival, the human is absolutely different to the chimp. Right? The human could not possibly survive in the way the chimp does. So actually the differences between the human and the chimp there are really very, very, very great. The chimp can cling, the human can't cling, and it's a very important difference. But most fascinating for me in that example, which I've heard before, is the idea that there's some pre-evolution in the male monkey who already knows about trucks, who already knows about wheels, it's just, if only had the language to say, we could invent the wheel. It's really fascinating. Really, it's really worth discussing that example because of what it. But again, we're very willing to believe that these differences can be illustrated to us.
I think there is a lot more to discuss, and I think some of this might take a while to recover from the bombshells about chimps not driving. So, anyway, on that note, please join me in that.